Anyway, this is a quote of William B. Ryan, who's a foremost figure in this form, at least. I love this quote. The question itself is false. I'm not even going to say anything about that. Okay, I introduced this article. This is actually what happens is, if you want my account of it, I thoroughly defeated these people on every account. I mean, I've been fighting these wars for a jillion years, and it was kind of interesting to learn where they were at. Well, after doing so, this guy William B. Ryan, I discover he's got an article out. Really, it's largely ad hominem and preposterous claim. Vicious. So I read it, and actually I can't remember. I think somebody else pointed out to me. But anyway, so I wrote him back about it, and this article is the result of what I wrote back, my reply, which he hasn't dared answer it since. So I have an introduction to this, and I'll just read it. Because exploitation of an ostensibly self-ruling public only survives by corruption, apathy, and disinformation, and has few conceivable prizes compared to those of denying us monetary rectitude, the prospect of establishing monetary justice exists only in a more significant conviction to prevail over all disinformation. Merely to require the truth is to end apathy. But only to find and exert it is to leave corruption no way to prevail over an apprehending republic, having means to implement its findings. And this will be a principle that we exercise in next week's program in our explanation of how we, the people, are going to solve these things very quickly without problems. A deserving public, therefore, at least bores to the truth at every necessary occasion, recognizing that disinformation is intolerable to every good purpose. It is an obligation to each other, then, so often and without exception, to meet all opposition to monetary representation with the most exhaustive, incisive scrutiny. Nothing less, in fact, can apprehend what we only call interest and economy, particularly when the only possible accomplishment of imposing the former and pretending the latter is exploitation. This singular possible purpose of exploitation both compels and simplifies the present task because it certifies a fault in arguments which can only intend to promote exploitation, and secondly, because this fact reduces our work to no more than sifting through the arguments until we find the intended deception. These, of course, will even be announced because they are the whole purpose of the disinformation. Thus, the present essay responds to just such a class and faction of opposition to monetary solution. While William B. Ryan's ad hominems and obfuscation may advance no real or useful discipline, critical thinkers will first question what possible benefit can descend from the obvious standards of participation which follow. Still, it is the critical thinker who may be surprised most to hear everywhere and in no more than the wake of Mr. Ryan's dubious efforts that the debt virus theory, or Ryan's own 10 can't repay 11 fallacy, which I quote him, that's the name he gave to this paper that he proudly presented at the Kent State University Capital Ownership Group. Okay, or Ryan's own 10 can't repay 11 fallacy, or even actual mathematically perfected economy are claimed to be disproven. For we must be cynical to anticipate how the following assertions will proliferate despite their obvious wickedness and faults. Yet Mr. Ryan's intended disproof does not even address mathematically perfected economy. and quite evidently because Mr. Ryan finds, even in himself, no capacity to effectively assault its facts of solution. I'll prove this to you. Quite conspicuously, Ryan merely hopes instead to convince us that the most critical and obvious issue solved by mathematically perfected economy does not even exist. This is why I'm bringing this article up. This is a way that people, such as William B. Ryan, have thought that they might have disproved mathematically perfected economy. So we're going through their disproof and my disproof of their disproof. And thus, by no more than insinuation, he hopes first that we fail to realize that his own testimony proves what he means to disprove, so that we may further neglect how mathematically perfected economy indeed solves all the categoric faults which Ryan does not even contest. Most obviously, if interest indeed multiplies debt in proportion to a vital circulation, as Ryan himself inadvertently proves, then certainly eradication of interest solves not only all accumulating iniquity, but inevitable monetary failure. At issue, then, is the very fundamental cause of the present crisis, projected 25 years ago by computer models, and this is, written quite some time ago. By computer models I provided the Reagan administration, in which you can still download from these pages to replicate a projection which depends wholly and singularly upon the very process Ryan means to deny exists. If, as I hold then, and as inherent irreversible multiplication of debt by interest is thus the fundamental cause of artificial worldwide monetary failure, then if, quote, economists, unquote, are to prevail by Ryan's trivial obfuscations, you are to be denied solution that exploitation can persist, even at the price of worldwide monetary failure, which is the price of all these plagiarists. To apprehend Ryan's innuendo is thus to resolve for yourself the nefarious work by which the world has been committed without either its understanding or assent to the enrichment and destiny of the faction Ryan means to perpetuate. So I give a little background on this. I'll try and read this through quickly. More than 10 years ago, the William B. Ryan of the present controversy emailed an invitation to join the Social Credit Forum, which advocates Douglas' A plus B theorem. While Ryan's initial email outwardly appeared to be a cordial invitation to explain my original theses, A, that any purported economy subject to interest inherently terminates itself under insoluble debt, and B, that there is one and one only integral solution for the categoric faults of the resultant purported economies, his appeal proved no more than an intended ambush in which Mr. Ryan himself evidently wished at least to enjoy a most prominent role. The present essay, in other words, he sought the comfort of numbers. He didn't present his arguments to me alone. The present essay responds to Ryan's most recent and assumably polished efforts, his best job. The derision 10 years ago was even far more coarse. Within minutes of responding to Mr. Ryan's invitation, I received dozens of irate emails assaulting my requested presentation with a strange admixture of social credit and Austrian dogma. Who was I to advocate mathematics can either identify, solve, or prove solution of categoric faults of purported economy? No, Douglas had already identified the problem as the difference between what workers were paid and the whole of industrial income. Who was I to advocate instead that we must perpetually replenish a vital circulation if we are obligated to pay the sum of all principal and interest out of our possession from a general circulation comprised of never more than some of the remaining principal? Who was I to demonstrate further then that so long as we must reborrow interest to maintain that vital circulation, that so long as we must reborrow principal as new debt equal to the former debt and interest as new debt above the sum of former debt, debt is inherently and irreversibly multiplied in proportion to the vital circulation until we succumb to terminal failure. In other words, all these guys that you call economies are arguing about this against mathematically perfected economy, not saying how it's right to charge interest and not proving it, and denying that it has the effects that we see everywhere around us. The Social Credit Forum meant to laugh this idea off the planet that the world's economies are inherently terminal because they inevitably multiply exploitation beyond what the exploited can give up. To their assertions, this failure would never happen. I spent 2 weeks exhaustively explaining to hundreds of emails how it was happening then, everywhere about them. Half a dozen years later, Ryan offers his present attempt to prove interest does not multiply debt into terminal failure. Well, you should be interested in this because it's a typical attempt of a so-called economist to disprove that interest multiplies artificial debt into inevitable failure. And so this is the whole importance of this paper, wading through a little bit of it here. Conspicuous in his own inadvertent proof of the contrary is that the faction he represents uniformly avoids the initial fundamental questions why banks should be allowed to collect principal and interest for merely publishing our promises to pay. After all, the true creditor gave up property. I've been saying this forever, as I told you, for notes which are merely published by the banking system, and this arrangement certainly denies the true creditor interest to take for no more than the cost of tokenizing the debtor's obligation, first principal equal to all the wealth ever so financed, and secondly, to perpetually multiply that unjustified taking by interest. To strategically evade these questions is to recognize the indefensible purposes of these obfuscations, compounding the hypocrisy of Ryan's ploy. Douglas, of course, evidently wanted to identify a cause which he perceived to generate the disadvantages ascertained by the theses Ryan asked me to submit. But Douglas doesn't even focus on the dubious mechanics of a mere published currency subject to interest, which of course is the logical beginning of any quest for fundamental cause or any potential problem whatever. An efficient search begins at the root. A genuine quest is to find, not to ignore, and not even finding a public mandate or purpose for such a currency. Most of all, then, we should suspect not only the design, but the designers, particularly for the inevitability, severity, and incongruity of the consequences. Furthermore, whether the faults are incidental or intended is certainly decided by defending them for the sake of the consequences, which makes Ryan's ploy all the more transparent. Instead of unraveling the nature of the currency, Douglas settles on a supposed disparity which he deems to explain labor's ever greater disadvantages under such a system. He presumes that the difference between what is paid labor and what industry takes in makes it impossible for labor to afford to consume all industrial production. So you see my memory was accurate of these things. And that this explains some perpetual systemic deterioration. As his failure to identify cause likewise denies him the means to solve his non-existent deterioration, he instead, that is, his idea of it, he instead hopes to compensate for it, even if the first error further denies him the means to calculate the compensation. And yet, from the purposed perpetual social recourse, we understand the name of the resultant social credit movement. It's all about a perpetual handout which understandably has never gained much traction and which is completely unnecessary under mathematically perfected economy, which solves the cause of deterioration. Contrary to Douglas and the social credit faction, as the remainder of industrial income is dispersed to management and ownership, no fact even exists that labor should be able to consume all the production of industry. Douglas simply errs in considering only part of industrial income and part of the industrial market, presuming a part should have the power of the whole. Yet, obviously, no accumulating disparity exists in the mere division of income because soluble industrial income accounts for all the costs of production. including servicing irreversible multiplication of artificial debt, which inherently erodes margins of solubility, forcing prices ever upward until the costs of servicing the artificial debt infringe on a finite